When people remember France in 1792, they remember the streets. They remember the fall of the monarchy. They remember the fury of the revolution. They remember Paris shaking under violence, fear, and the conviction that an old world was being torn apart. But while history kept its eyes on what was happening below, something else was happening above, in the towers. Because when revolutionary workers began stripping bells from cathedrals and churches across France, they may have uncovered something no official record was prepared to explain. Not just bronze, not just supports and clockwork, but hidden chambers, geometric copper systems, resonant structures, mechanisms so strange and so exact that even the men dismantling them struggled to describe what they were looking at. And the more they removed, the less the towers looked like places built only for bells. The more they looked like the surviving shell of something older, something functional, something never meant to be taken apart in public. The official reason for the confiscations was simple. France was at war. The Republic needed metal. Bells were to be removed, catalogued, melted down, and repurposed for cannon shot and coinage. Across Paris and beyond, crews were sent into churches, civic towers, and cathedrals with a practical mission. Take the bronze, strip the towers, inventory what can be reclaimed. On paper, it was an act of wartime necessity. But practical missions have a way of exposing things that history prefers to leave untouched. Because bells do not hang in empty space. They hang inside systems, frames, supports, platforms, chambers, access routes. And once the workmen climbed beyond the visible bell platforms and began dismantling the structures around them, some accounts suggest they found far more than ordinary bell-hanging architecture. They found complexity. The kind of complexity that becomes harder to ignore the longer you look at it. At first, the discoveries were easy to dismiss. Old tower machinery, perhaps, forgotten reinforcements from earlier restorations. Elaborate metalwork added across centuries. Europe's great cathedrals had been repaired, altered, and expanded so many times that almost any anomaly could be filed under the convenient heading of renovation. That was the safe explanation. It was also the explanation that quickly began to fail. Because what appeared inside some of those towers did not look like the leftover clutter of centuries. It looked deliberate, integrated, mathematically arranged. Components were found whose proportions seemed too exact to be ornamental. Copper formations whose placement made little sense as structural support. Geometric arrangements that did not resemble standard bell frames and chambers, whose dimensions appeared tuned to something more precise than the simple ringing of bronze over a city. In scattered removal records and later references, the same kind of language keeps surfacing. Unexpected mechanisms, excessive complexity, purpose unclear. That phrasing matters, not because it proves what the systems were, but because it reveals the moment when ordinary explanation began to falter. If the workers had found nothing but bells, timber braces, and clockwork, there would have been no need for ambiguity. The reports could have remained dry and technical. Instead, some descriptions seemed to strain against what the writers were willing to say directly. And behind that hesitation, a pattern begins to emerge. Inside towers such as Notre Dame and other major Parisian churches, removal crews reportedly encountered acoustic chambers built with proportions so exact that they appeared tuned. Not random cavities, not simple bell lofts, but spaces shaped to preserve focus or amplify vibration. Some chambers seem to have shared the same harmonic ratios across entirely different buildings, even when those buildings belong to different centuries, different architectural styles, and different religious foundations. That should not happen by accident. Different builders do not usually reproduce the same hidden acoustic logic, unless they are following a known tradition. Yet no ordinary tradition seems to account cleanly for what these fragments describe. Bell founding manuals do not explain it. Campanology does not fully explain it. Decorative architecture certainly does not explain it. And that is where the unease begins. Because once multiple towers start revealing the same concealed pattern, the question is no longer about one unusual church. It becomes a question about whether Paris itself had inherited a hidden system no one in 1792 fully understood. The first anomaly was tuning. According to surviving descriptions, tower chambers in different parts of the city appear to have shared the same underlying resonant intervals. Not identical in every visible detail, but aligned in proportion arrangement and response. Acoustic channels in one tower corresponded to channels in another. Chamber dimensions followed recurring ratios. Bell spaces that should have differed according to local design instead seemed to echo the same deeper template. It was as though every major tower in Paris had been built into an older pattern, a frequency pattern, a concealed geometry, a design that no longer appeared in any architectural teaching, but still survived in stone and metal above the streets. And as the crews climbed higher and dismantled deeper into the tower interiors, the systems became stranger. They began finding copperwork that looked nothing like ordinary supports, spiral arrays, coiled arrangements, conduits embedded in wall passages, metal channels that extended beyond the visible bell platforms and vanished into the thickness of the towers themselves. Some copper surfaces were unusually smooth, almost reflective. Others were arranged in repeating geometric relationships that seemed too precise for decorative work and too unnecessary for simple structural reinforcement. That kind of precision changes the tone of the story. Because decorative complexity is one thing, functional exactness is another. If these systems had merely been ornate, they could be explained as embellishment. If they had merely been old, they could be explained as restoration debris. But what made them unsettling was the sense that they had been arranged for performance. Not artistic performance, technical performance. They looked tuned, and then came the crystalline deposits. This is where the surviving descriptions become especially difficult to dismiss. Certain metal surfaces inside the tower chambers were reportedly coated with unusual mineral or crystal-like formations, not random corrosion, not loose residue, but patterned accretions that appeared aligned with the geometry of the copper systems themselves. In later interpretations, these formations have been described as the kind of deposits that would require long-term exposure to intense and sustained vibrational activity. That detail is deeply troubling. Because bells ring in intervals. Ceremonies are periodic. Even a heavily used cathedral does not usually subject its hidden metal systems to the kind of constant resonance needed to produce systematic crystalline growth over long durations. So, why were these deposits there? Why did they appear not chaotic, but consistent? Why did they seem to form along paths, channels, and nodes, as though the metal had once participated in a process far more sustained than ceremonial ringing? The usual answer is that the workers misunderstood what they were seeing. That corrosion mineral accumulation and age were interpreted through the anxiety and upheaval of the revolutionary moment. That is possible, but it does not resolve the full problem. Because the mineral formations were not the only strange element. The chambers themselves were unusual. Some were described as geometrically flawless spaces hidden above the obvious bell platform's rooms, with proportions too exact to seem accidental. Others had wall arrangements lined with copper in ways that did not support a bell, did not resemble a clock, and did not align with any straightforward liturgical purpose. In certain cases, the rooms appear to have been sealed for long periods, packed behind later barriers, or inaccessible through ordinary maintenance paths. Once opened, they seemed preserved, undisturbed, intact enough to suggest that the systems inside had not simply fallen apart through neglect, but had been hidden. That distinction matters. Neglect leaves decay, concealment leaves silence. And silence hangs over these towers more heavily the further the evidence goes. Because the more complex the systems appear to have been, the less clearly they were described in later accounts. Some drawings flatten them into decorative outlines. Some reports reduce them to features of no consequence. Others omit the most unusual chambers entirely. The broadest views disappear. The richest sketches are scattered. The language narrows from curiosity into vagueness. That is not proof of a cover-up in the dramatic sense. But it is the kind of documentary behavior that appears when a discovery becomes inconvenient. One of the most striking features mentioned in later reconstructions of these accounts is the presence of large spherical metal housings. These were not bells in any simple sense. Not ordinary casings, not ornamental globes, not familiar fittings from a bell tower. They were described as too symmetrical, too balanced, and too precisely formed. Some were hollow, with inner cavity structures that seemed functional. Others were associated with surrounding copper arrays and positioned inside chambers whose geometry suggested resonance rather than decoration. Imagine standing inside an ancient cathedral tower, expecting to remove a bell only to discover a chamber built around a polished metal sphere whose purpose no manual can explain. That is the tone of the mystery. These forms were later reduced to harmless labels, decorative features, bell-related metalwork, obsolete architectural elements. But the descriptions resist those reductions. They speak of manufactured spheres, resonators, metal forms associated with surrounding patterns and channels, as if they were meant to interact with the chambers around them. And interaction is the key word, because once you stop looking at the tower as a place where a bell simply hangs and start looking at it as a place where chambers, coils, conduits, and resonant volumes interact, the entire structure changes meaning. The bell becomes only the visible component. The tower becomes the instrument, or perhaps not even an instrument in the musical sense. A node, a terminal, a visible crown above a hidden system. That possibility only deepens when the conduits are considered. Some of the most enigmatic descriptions refer to channels extending through tower walls beyond the known boundaries of bell installations, interconnecting chambers, or descending through the masonry in ways that made little conventional sense. These were not random gaps in stone. They were organized paths, calculated placements, infrastructure embedded into the architecture itself. And once infrastructure appears, the scale of the mystery expands. Because an isolated mechanism can be dismissed as curiosity, a network cannot. If the conduits inside one tower were mirrored by similar hidden channels in others, and if those towers shared the same resonant proportions, then what the revolutionary crews may have stumbled into was not a series of odd architectural details, but fragments of a coordinated system stretching across Paris, perhaps beyond Paris. A city-wide harmonic design, a buried acoustic grid, a pattern of energy frequency or resonance hidden in plain sight for centuries beneath the outward function of church bells and religious ritual. That sounds extreme only until the alternative is considered. that across multiple major towers, builders repeatedly created concealed copper arrays, resonance chambers, sealed geometric rooms, spherical housings, and crystalline-coated conduits for no coherent purpose at all. Possible, perhaps, but increasingly awkward. As the removals continued, something else began to happen. The most complex mechanisms were often the first to disappear. Officially, that is easy to explain. France needed metal. Anything valuable in bronze or copper would naturally be prioritized for dismantling and melting. But witnesses and later readers of the record seem to have noticed a pattern inside that practical explanation. The pieces removed most quickly were often the very systems that appeared least bell-like and most anomalous. The geometric resonators, the refined copper arrays, the sealed spherical structures, the chambers whose proportions and deposits implied sustained technical use. Simple bells could remain for a time. The strangest systems were dismantled first. That is the kind of pattern that makes a story linger. Not because it proves intention beyond doubt, but because it consistently aligns destruction with anomaly. The more a system resisted the accepted explanation, the faster it seems to have been reclaimed, stripped, or erased. And that leads to a deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if the wartime confiscations did more than reclaim metal? What if they also destroyed the evidence of a pre-existing technological layer hidden inside Europe's great towers, not an invention of the revolution, not a product of 18th century engineering, but an inherited infrastructure already there, already integrated, already misunderstood by the time the Republic's workers climbed into those chambers to dismantle it? That would explain the extraordinary precision. It would explain the recurring frequency ratios across multiple structures. It would explain the sense that later generations had maintained or repurposed these systems without fully understanding them. It would explain why so many of the most important details survive not in polished official reports, but in fragments, technical margins, private notes, and ambiguous sketches. It would also explain the urgency of destruction. Because if the upper towers of Paris contained systems that hinted at a more advanced acoustic science than the official chronology allowed, then leaving those systems intact would raise questions too large for the moment. Questions about cathedrals, questions about pre-modern engineering, questions about what Europe inherited rather than invented. Questions about whether those bells had always been bells, or whether they had once been part of something much larger. A continental network, a frequency architecture, a visible religious surface wrapped around an older technological core. And perhaps that is why the records grow quieter as the operations continue. The early language is practical. The later language becomes guarded. The first sketches attempt description. The later diagrams become selective. The towers do not simply yield bronze, they yield ambiguity. And then the ambiguity is melted down along with the metal. By the close of 1792, much of what had been revealed inside the great towers had reportedly been dismantled, stripped, or destroyed. Chambers were emptied. Systems were broken apart. Components were sent to furnaces. Other spaces were sealed again behind masonry or structural barriers. The visible bells remained part of history. The concealed acoustic infrastructure did not. And yet enough seems to have survived to leave a pattern. Resonance chambers too exact for ordinary bell use. Copper systems too geometric for decoration. Crystalline deposits too consistent for random corrosion. Spherical resonators too precise for casual ornament. Conduits too organized to be accidental. Each on its own might be dismissed. Together they begin to feel like the outline of something older, not a finished proof, a pressure. Pressure exerted by repetition. Pressure exerted by design. Pressure exerted by silence. And once that pressure builds, the familiar story of cathedral towers begins to shift. The bells remain, the rituals remain, the architecture remains. But beneath the accepted purpose, another possibility starts to take shape. That Europe's great towers were not built merely to call the faithful, but to house and transmit a function long since forgotten. If that sounds impossible, consider how many ancient structures survive only through reuse. How often one civilization builds over another. How often older systems are wrapped in new meaning until the original function becomes invisible. What later centuries call sacred or symbolic may once have been active, technical, and precise in ways no surviving manual still admits. That may be what the revolutionary crews briefly encountered. Not just bells, not just confiscated metal, but the remains of a hidden frequency infrastructure embedded inside the most iconic towers of Europe. And if even part of that is true, then the real importance of 1792 lies not in what was taken down, but in what was accidentally exposed during the process. Because for a brief moment the towers opened. Workers climbed into spaces the public never saw. They dismantled visible forms and uncovered invisible systems. They found chambers that seemed built for resonance rather than prayer. They found copper networks that looked more like transmission than ornament. They found evidence that the visible bell may have been only the final, simplified expression of something far older. Then the dismantling continued. The metal was reclaimed. The chambers were emptied. The records grew thin. The official story hardened. And what had briefly surfaced was pushed back beneath explanation. That is why the final question matters so much. Not whether every detail can be proven beyond doubt, but why the most sophisticated systems were the ones most quickly destroyed. Why the most unusual chambers were reduced to decorative language. Why the most coherent technical drawings were never gathered into a single central account. Why the surviving evidence feels like fragments of a larger architecture no one was allowed to see whole. Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The resonance chambers were dismantled. The copper arrays were dismantled. The spherical resonators were dismantled. The conduits were dismantled. The systems that most strongly challenged the official chronology were dismantled. And once dismantled, they could be forgotten. Or rather, forgotten in the specific way history often forgets things. Not erased completely, just broken apart, renamed, scattered, reduced to something harmless enough to survive in the margins without threatening the center of the story. For one brief moment in 1792, as revolutionary France stripped metal from its towers, another history may have become visible. A history not of bells, but of resonance. Not of worship alone, but of engineered frequency. Not of isolated cathedrals, but of interconnected structures aligned to principles no official archive was willing to preserve. Then the furnaces did their work. The Republic moved forward. The towers remained. The visible symbols survived. The deeper systems vanished. And what had been exposed became something more dangerous than architecture. It became implication. Because if the great towers of Paris once concealed a technological vocabulary, more advanced, more harmonically precise, and more interconnected than the accepted timeline allows, then the real mystery is not confined to one revolution or one city. The real mystery is how many towers once carried the same hidden language, how many cathedrals, how many bell chambers, how many civic towers, how many structures whose upper rooms were emptied, melted, or quietly simplified before anyone thought to document them as more than curiosities. Maybe the workers of 1792 found nothing but misunderstood remnants of old European craftsmanship. Or maybe they found something else, something inherited, something functional, something older than the monarchy that ordered those cathedrals maintained, older than the republic that ordered them stripped, older even than the faith later wrapped around them. If that is true, then the bells were never the whole story. They were only what remained visible after the deeper system had already been forgotten. And somewhere above the streets, in towers still standing over Paris and beyond the architecture, may still remember what the archives no longer do. A hidden tuning, a buried geometry, a network of chambers once built not only to be seen, but to resonate. And if even part of that memory survives in stone, then perhaps the revolution did not only tear down an old world. For a brief moment, it also opened one. If this stayed with you, there are more towers, cities, and buried systems where history may be hiding far more than it admits.